and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Sam.
Yesterday morning, news broke that well-known broadcaster Alan Jones had been arrested at his home in Sydney over alleged indecent assaults. Later in the day, police announced that he'd been charged with 24 offences. Now, this was a really big story because of who Alan Jones is and the power he's held in both media and political spheres in Australia for the past few decades.
I think the identity of Alan Jones and the power that he holds is really at the heart of this story and why he's been such a permanent fixture in Australian media and political circles for so long. For anyone who isn't across Alan Jones, give me a sense of who he is.
Yeah, so when I sat down to write this podcast, I thought I knew a lot about Alan Jones's career. You know, you're told these stories when you enter the industry about someone that had been there for years and years and years. But it turns out that he's had quite a unique career trajectory. So he's not someone that entered journalism straight out of university and then stayed there his whole career. Alan Jones, who right now is in his early 80s, he actually started his career as an English teacher and a rugby teacher at King's, so the King's School in Sydney.
Which is a really prestigious private school.
Yeah, exactly. And then in the mid-70s, he moved into the political realm. He worked as a speechwriter and then ran for pre-selection in the seat of Eden Monero, which he subsequently lost, but that didn't deter him. And Alan Jones later ran for two different seats for the Liberal Party. He lost both of those as well, but he stayed in those kind of political spheres and later became a speechwriter for the then Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. Then there was a bit of a switch up in his career and Alan Jones went back into the sporting world where he became the coach of the Wallabies in 1983. But then he moved into broadcasting and it's there that Alan Jones's profile really began to grow. So he became a radio host on Sydney talkback radio stations 2UE and later 2GB. And for decades, he hosted those shows. He also regularly wrote opinion columns for News Corp's many newspapers and had a dedicated show on Sky News up until 2021.
And those shows that he was involved with, whether it be on radio, television, or his work in print, it did incredibly well. He was a very popular host and some of those radio numbers were huge.
Yeah, I mean, he held that number one spot for so long and so many politicians had their run, you know, facing off against Alan Jones on 2GB. It was almost this rite of passage, I guess.
But then I think the reason why a lot of our listeners might be familiar with the name Alan Jones is not necessarily because of his media career, but when he is in the media himself.
Yeah. He certainly made and continues to make a lot of headlines himself. There are a number of controversies that Alan Jones himself was embroiled in, and he was a shock jock for decades. So, you know, it was almost his trade to say shocking things. But I do want to just zero in, I guess, on two of the more better known attacks that really defined the latter part of Alan Jones's media career. So the first was an attack he made against Australia's first and only female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. So back in 2012, he claimed Gillard should be put in a chaff bag and dumped at sea. He also suggested that her father, who at that time had recently passed, that he had died of shame. He later publicly apologised for those comments, but now when people retrospectively look back on the Gillard prime ministership, those comments do feature very prominently and a lot of the kind of discourse around gender that emerged during that time.
Including her own analysis of how media treated her during that period.
Yeah, exactly. But that wasn't the only female leader of a country that Alan Jones targeted. More recently, he suggested that former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison should have shoved a sock down the throat of former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. So that was in 2019. At the time, he also said that he hoped Scott Morrison, quote, gets tough here with a few backhanders and that he goes for the throat. The Australian media regulator, ACMA, eventually found that Alan Jones had breached broadcasting rules in when he said those things. And there was this real mass exodus of advertising partners from 2GB in response to the comments he had made about Jacinda Ardern. Perhaps, there it's a really interesting analysis of how much had changed, I guess, since 2012 when those comments were made about Julia Gillard to 2019 when they were made about Jacinda Ardern. Alan Jones eventually wrote an apology letter to Jacinda Ardern and said on air that he had made a mistake.
I think many would agree that the other big change from 2012 to 2019 was the fact that advertisers started to pull their support from Alan Jones's program. That happened in 2019. A year later, in 2020, Alan Jones stepped down from hosting his show on 2GB.
Yeah, he said at the time that was due to doctor's orders, but the Sydney Morning Herald, who, we'll get into in a little bit, has written quite a lot about Alan Jones. In an article, they said that there was a commercial imperative for Alan Jones to get off air because advertisers had continued to boycott his show after the Ardern comments, and that it was becoming commercially basically unviable for him to remain on air with so many advertisers pulling away.
So just to go back and recap, we have somebody involved in the school system who then enters politics and then enters rugby and then enters the media, makes controversial comments, part of his personality, and then steps down in 2020. What's happened since then?
After retiring from radio, as he put it, Alan Jones ended up joining a streaming news channel. It's called ADH TV. And it essentially just hosts a range of conservative political commentators, of which he was one of. His last show on that channel, though, was in November of last year. And that's an important date because a month later, in December of last year, the Sydney Morning Herald published its first investigation into Alan Jones. Before we go on, though, I do want to just say how interesting this is, just as an aside about the Australian media market. 2GB, which is, of course, the station Alan Jones hosted a show on for so long, and the Sydney Morning Herald, who ran this investigation into Alan Jones, are owned by the same company. So Nine owns both 2GB and the Sydney Morning Herald, alongside, of course, a whole host of different publications. But I thought that that's just an interesting quirk to keep in mind. So in that investigation that was first published in December 2023 by the Sydney Morning Herald, journalist Kate McClymont alleged that Alan Jones, quote, used his position of power to prey on a number of young men, indecently assaulting them, groping or inappropriately touching them without consent. So that's a direct quote from the article that went live almost a year ago. The article went on to detail a whole host of allegations made by a number of different men across a really kind of long period of time. When McClymont actually published that article, it did include a statement from Alan Jones's legal team, who said at the time, "Our client denies ever having indecently assaulted the persons referred to in your letter, and your suggestion that he has is scandalous, grossly offensive, and seriously defamatory of him."
So the article comes out and Alan Jones and his legal team strongly deny the claims in it, maintain his innocence. At that point, there's no kind of follow-on from law enforcement or anything. But that's why we're talking about this today, right?
Yeah, so yesterday we found out that Alan Jones had been arrested at his home at about 7:45 a.m. over allegations that he had indecently assaulted young men. Now, a statement from police said that the state's child abuse squad had established a strike force earlier this year in March to investigate a number of alleged indecent assaults and sexual touching incidents between 2001 and 2019. That's a direct quote from the New South Wales Police's media release. Now, the statement said that following extensive inquiries, an 83-year-old man had been arrested, who we now, of course, know is Alan Jones. New South Wales Police Commissioner Karen Webb said in a press conference that the arrest had followed what she called a very complex investigation. Here's a bit more of what she said.
I can't speculate in this particular case, but what is often the case is when it is known, the full circumstances and those parties involved, other people may come forward. And we are anticipating that other people may come forward.
And Zara, do we know what Jones was actually charged with?
Yes, so later yesterday, New South Wales Police did get up and do another full press conference in the afternoon, and they revealed that Alan Jones had been charged with 24 offences against 8 victims between 2001 and 2019. So these are crimes that allegedly occurred over 2 decades. Police also revealed that the youngest of the victims was 17 when the alleged crime took place. The charges include 11 counts of aggravated indecent assault, where the alleged victim was under the authority of the offender, 9 charges related to assault with active indecency, 2 charges of common assault, and 2 charges of sexual touching.
I want to go back to one phrase you just mentioned, under the authority. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so police explained this, and they said that by authority, they're referring to the employment of contracts, so in a professional workplace setting.
Okay, so what happens now?
Well, Jones has been given conditional bail, and he's due next to appear before court on December 18th this year, so in a couple of weeks. The conditions around the bail include requirements that he's not allowed to contact or harass the alleged victims, and there are also some travel restrictions on him. Interestingly, New South Wales Police also said that that strike force I mentioned earlier is still ongoing and that they're still talking to people. And as we heard before, they are expecting more people to now potentially come forward. Police also said that they had seized a number of electronic devices at Alan Jones's apartment yesterday, so who knows where this could go.
So the next big milestone in this story is that December 18 court date that you're referring to. Zara will keep everybody in the loop when that comes around. And thank you for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning. If this story has raised anything for you, there's always 1-800-RESPECT to reach out to. They're available on 1-800-737-732. That's all we've got time for this morning, but we'll be back this afternoon with some headlines. Have a great day.